I'd like to call to order the September 18th, 2024 meeting of the City of Santa Monica's Planning Commission. And I'd like to start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And the roll call, please.
Commissioner Chaco,
Here.
Commissioner Fresco,
Here.
Commissioner Hamilton,
Here.
Commissioner Reese,
Present.
and Chair Tolkien.
Yes. Now the Planning Director's report.
Good evening, Commission. So your next regular meeting would be October 2nd, but that's canceled. October 9th is a special meeting where we'll bring the safety element update for your recommendation. And then on October 16th, there's a minor use permit appeal at 1700 Ocean Avenue. Recently at City Council on September 10th, the council adopted the most recent REACH code for zero emission buildings. So that, I think, goes for second reading in a couple of weeks. And then upcoming at City Council on September 24th, which is next week, the council will be reviewing the housing element implementation. And those are the implementation measures you all have been working on for the past several months. And then on the 22nd of October, we're taking another one of the Promenade Economic Recovery ordinances, and that addresses some of the code issues that have been identified by potential tenants. So what we're trying to do there is make it as easy as possible for restaurants and other uses to open on the promenade in the downtown area. What the council has done so far has been very successful, and this is a little bit more refinement to those. Really, the main topic in this one is the promenade signage. So it will allow more different types of signage, more signage area than what's currently allowed. So again, we've heard from tenants who are looking to potentially locate on the promenade, and they have some creative ideas, which I think are pretty typical now of different shopping districts. So the new code would allow those types of sign exceptions. That concludes my report.
May I ask a question?
What?
May I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Are those sign adjustments, facade adjustments, let's say, respectful, I should say, of the design standards we have in the DCP about preserving facades? I guess we'll discuss that when it comes to us.
Yeah, they do identify places where like the digital signage would be allowed, and Jean could explain it better, but there's like a sign ban that's kind of a typical area of a building.
I'm talking about more expansive things that would impact
So I guess,
facade materials and things that are specifically called out as to be retained in downtown.
yeah, I think so. For clarity, this is actually not coming to the Planning Commission because the changes to the sign code do not require a recommendation from the commission.
So it's only signs and no other treatments to facades?
It's signs.
Okay.
It's signs, yeah.
All right, that's what I really wanted to know. Thank you.
I happen to have a sheet for this item from Amy Gottstein. Is she able to do that?
I'll ask my question afterwards.
Go ahead.
Hi, good evening. I spoke recently about the Spiridion new permitting system that's coming in. It will take 18 months before that is implemented, but I'm afraid my point was missed last time, so I'm back. The problem is the humans in the departments that operate that system and that are not complying with regulations, existing regulations in this city, and that harms tenants directly. So when the city does not comply with its own regulations, tenants suffer. Now, I met with Mr. Martin in 2018 about these issues. Nothing has changed. We met earlier this year in March, and nothing has changed. Now, I have made, how many would you say, a dozen, maybe more attempts to contact you by email, by phone, because I had follow-up questions about policies and procedures largely relating to the community development department that you oversee. Now, you recently said to me that even though you've been heading this department for over a decade, that you were not the person, you could not answer those questions. And I'm really concerned about that, because if you, as the head of the department, cannot answer these questions, who can? I will also remind you that it was June 20th that I handed to you a list of questions because you won't return my emails or my phone calls or make any attempts to reach out to me. I'm here to intercept you to talk about these kind of things. And so I'm concerned about the neglect of tenants throughout this city. You have no idea what the pain and agony is of an ongoing construction project in your home. None of y'all know. Y'all don't know what it's like to live in dust, in holes in your walls, holes in your ceiling, no heat in the winter, and no protections from the city with existing regulations. So this is a real problem, and I'm tired of y'all talking about signs and pot shops and the Bergamot station and all of that fun stuff without kind of getting to the core of what the problem is here, is that you're not looking out for tenants, like actual residents of this city. And so I'm going to ask you, Mr. Martin, when can I expect answers to those questions that I handed to you on June 20th?
Ma'am, this is not question and answers. This
That's
is-
fine.
This
Still a
is
good
just public
question.
statement, and in fact, we actually went in the wrong category for this.
Not
but you
really,
made-
because it was about Spiridion, and that's a recent city
Okay.
council discussion matter.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, 18 months.
I had a question regarding the city, your report. In looking at just a question about the promenade, and a lot of the critiques and that we hear is that the floor plates are very large on the promenade, and it kind of restricts the types of tenants that can occupy that space. Is the city seeing any permits to break up that space into smaller retail areas? So, there could be a more variety of tenants moving in?
We haven't actually seen a lot of permits or applications for that type of division of the space. We have addressed that in our ordinances, though. We've made it very clear that it's certainly possible to have a use off the alley and then another use off the promenade, so to break it up that way. A owner can certainly break them up kind of widthwise on the promenade. The problem is, like, if you have a 50-foot building, you start to get pretty narrow then, and then you have like a 25-foot wide store space that goes back 150 feet. So it still creates these awkward spaces, but there's nothing in the code that prevents that from happening. I'll say it is a topic that's been discussed for a very long time. I feel like there are solutions to that, and there are ways to break those spaces up, but I don't know of any applications or.
Just curious to
do
hear if
that.
anyone is taking us up on that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
okay. Nothing, not a lot at this moment.
yeah,
then.
but again,
Okay.
we're aware of that issue, and we've definitely made sure that the code would allow that. So there's nothing preventing it from a code perspective.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Any other announcements from the commissioners?
Yeah, just not an announcement for staff. I'm gonna ask you guys to help me a little bit with next week. I'm supposed to come and support the housing element stuff, and I'd like to just kind of compare notes with you before I do my, and where I fall into that presentation too. Thank you.
I'd like to say that if anybody else wants to talk to the commission, it should be about stuff that comes before us, and that's within our purview, and they can submit a chit to the commission secretary. The next item would be, is there any public input
I think we just have
on
that.
any of the items? There's no consent calendar. And then we have item 8A and staff presentation to us.
So I will just give a brief introduction. There's actually been, this is meant to be an introductory study session for the Planning Commission on adult use cannabis. We were actually, had to move pretty quickly last summer in response to council direction. Just some background, Measure HMP was passed by the voters in November of '22, and council had expressed that interest and directed staff to, bring back information regarding adult use cannabis. So in the midst of kind of the race to do all of that work, we realized that the Planning Commission really has never formally received any information regarding adult use cannabis. And where we are in the program now is coming to you to give you this information in preparation for future hearings on adult use cannabis ordinance. So tonight, you'll hear from the adult use cannabis team. It's Shira Moak at the dais, Anna Fernandez, and Tony Kim. And no actions tonight, really giving you information, the opportunity to ask questions. If you want to provide some direction or anything like that, we're also open to receiving that. So I'll turn it over to Shira.
Thank you, Jing. So tonight we'll be walking you through a brief history of cannabis in Santa Monica, City Council's policy direction, preliminary concepts for a cannabis ordinance, cannabis social equity, next steps and implementation, and then we'll end with questions and discussion. The city first adopted regulations for medicinal cannabis in June of 2015 as part of the city's comprehensive zoning ordinance update, which enabled up to 2 medicinal cannabis retailers within the city, subject to a regulatory permit and selection process. All other cannabis-related uses were prohibited. The dispensaries were allowed only along limited sections of Wilshire Boulevard and Santa Monica Boulevard within the mixed-use Boulevard Low, mixed-use Boulevard, or general commercial zones, subject to a conditional use permit. November of 2016, California voters approved Proposition 64, also called the Adult Use of Marijuana Act, which allows adults 21 years of age or older to legally grow, possess, or use marijuana for personal, non-medical adult use purposes with certain restrictions. It also established state taxes on the cultivation and sale of cannabis and specifically allowed local jurisdictions to impose their own taxes. In the November 2022 election, the voters approved Measure HMP, as Jing was mentioning, which enables the city to levy a business tax on every licensed cannabis business. On June 13th, 2023, the City Council held a study session on adult use cannabis, and the study session was in response to Council's May 10th, 2022 direction to schedule a study session regarding whether to allow for the sale of adult use cannabis. In response to council direction, staff initiated work on drafting the ordinance and conducted research of social equity programs in other cities to help inform Santa Monica's program. On November 14th, 2023, council adopted an interim zoning ordinance allowing the 2 approved medicinal cannabis retailers to also sell adult use cannabis and extended the IZO on December 19th, 2023. On January 19th, 2024, Santa Monica was awarded a $40,000 grant from the state to conduct an equity assessment to inform the adult use cannabis program. And then on April 23rd, 2024, council held an a second study session to provide direction on cannabis and social equity in Santa Monica and locational restrictions for adult use cannabis. For more detailed history of the cannabis industry locally and statewide, please refer to the staff report. And I will now pass it over to Tony to review City Council's policy direction and preliminary concepts for the cannabis ordinance.
Thanks, Shira. So we wanted to share with you some of the policy direction that we've received from the council up to this point regarding cannabis. The first, if it's not obvious, the council is interested in permitting legal adult use cannabis uses. And as Shira mentioned, the 2 medicinal cannabis retailers were permitted to sell adult use cannabis products pursuant to the IZO that was adopted in November of last year. The 2 retailers that are currently open are at 925 Wilshire Boulevard and 1418 Wilshire Boulevard. This map shows you a little bit of the kind of vicinity context around Santa Monica and existing cannabis retailers in the area. In comparison to Santa Monica, you can see the 2 retailers that are currently in Santa Monica, and then you get an idea of the existing cannabis retail market that's located around Santa Monica. So in terms of the type of cannabis uses that the council would like to see in the city, they basically said that they want to see all cannabis uses permitted in the city. So we're talking about the various uses that come between seed and sale. So from the beginning of the process to the end, which includes cultivation, manufacturing, testing, distribution, retail, which includes storefront retail as well as non-storefront retail in the form of delivery services, consumption lounges, as well as cannabis events. We're primarily focused at this point in the process on the retail aspect of the cannabis ordinance, but at some point we will follow with the other types of uses that the council would like to see. That's just a diagram showing kind of the process from beginning to end. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to come up with icons for consumption lounges and cannabis events, but that's included there. If you're wondering what cannabis events are, those are, if you think of like farmers markets or craft fairs, they're kind of what cannabis events are like. So in terms of the number of retailers and allowable locations, the council was not interested in a hard cap on the number of retailers in the city, and they wanted to allow the uses only in non-residential zones. In addition, they wanted to apply the state-required buffer of at least 600 feet from sensitive uses. So cannabis uses would have to be at least 600 feet from sensitive uses, which the state identifies as being schools, youth centers, and daycare centers. While the council is concerned with potential oversaturation of cannabis businesses, they did acknowledge that there are mechanisms to control the number of businesses, including zoning limitations such as minimum distances between cannabis businesses, as well as limits per block or geographical area. In addition, the buffers around sensitive uses, local jurisdictions can increase or decrease those buffers. The council was interested in maintaining the state buffer of 600 feet. Excuse me. So this map illustrates essentially when you apply those 600-foot buffers around sensitive uses in Santa Monica, again, schools, youth centers, and daycare centers, what you're left with are the parcels that are highlighted in yellow. So realistically, those are the eligible parcels where cannabis uses could be located in the city of Santa Monica in non-residential districts. So when you take that and apply another buffer, being a minimum distance between cannabis uses, this map shows basically council direction to apply a minimum buffer of 300 feet between cannabis uses. So what you get here is a hypothetical showing basically the maximum number of cannabis businesses you could have in the city, applying the state buffers around sensitive uses, as well as a 300-foot buffer between other cannabis uses. Again, this is a hypothetical. It shows a potential maximum. The expectation is that we won't get anywhere near this based on just how the market is. But this is just illustrating what the most could be. So staff has been researching other jurisdictions and their cannabis ordinances, and we've identified some preliminary concepts for the city's ordinance. We're still working on this and looking at the substance, but these are basically kind of some general, the general content of the ordinance would include items such as definitions, location and design standards, operating requirements, standards related to landscaping, lighting, litter and graffiti, the types of permits that would be required, the review authority on that, the application requirements, noticing, findings, conditions of approvals, information on potential appeals, and other legalese. So staff is continuing to work on this, and obviously at some point we'll be back with the actual draft of an ordinance. So with that, I'll turn it over to Anna, who will talk about cannabis social equity.
Okay, good evening. Social equity examines disparities between populations and provides access to the right opportunities to offset those inherent inequities. In the context of cannabis, this means first recognizing the disproportionate impacts minorities have faced due to the criminalization of cannabis. And equity programs create opportunities for those affected groups to succeed where they previously couldn't. For example, they could become business owners, or a percentage of the profits from the sale of cannabis can be reinvested back into the community. Social equity, in developing a social equity program, making it intentional and meaningful is of primary importance for especially our community. And in order to do that, we have to inform it by an equity assessment. The assessment is an unbiased report that compiles qualitative and quantitative data, which can include cannabis infractions and surveys. The data is analyzed within the historical context of cannabis enforcement in the community, and it also identifies demographics that have been most adversely impacted by the war on drugs. The data is then used to develop the equity program components such as benefits and the eligibility criteria that's recommended to best assist those groups that are identified. All right, so some of the challenges that we've been able to identify through our conversations with other cities that have equity programs is that through those conversations, we've learned that despite their best efforts, there seem to be some unavoidable challenges that affect the program for the participants and the administrators as well. An example that we ran across frequently was that the limited number of the equity applications invites competition, which is much easier to overcome for non-qualifying applicants that have higher access to capital. In speaking with an equity program participant, the process for obtaining permits may also require more of a hands-on approach, which is similar to continuing adult education, and that would severely impact our staff resources. The staff identified some preliminary considerations for the development of the program. Of particular importance, though, is that the program funding relies largely on state grants. We've been fortunate to get a portion of those funds already, but the award amounts for those grants may be diminished in the future, and the program may ultimately be terminated. So it's not something that we can rely on in the future, and the city will have to ultimately identify other funding resources for the program. Another consideration is that the guidelines for those grants may have parameters for how those funding is awarded in terms of for direct applicants and then for technical assistance. and it may not suit the way our program unfolds in the end. And I'll turn it back to Shira for the rest of the program.
Thank you, Anna. Cities have taken, I'm going to talk about selection process. So cities have taken a variety of approaches to the selection and permitting process for cannabis businesses. The application process can be designed to accommodate a variety of selection methods, including the following. Merit-based, where applicants are ranked according to their score. Top-ranked applicants are selected to move forward move forward in the permitting process consistent with the number of permits available. Equity, where priority is given to individuals who qualify for the Cannabis Equity Program as defined by the Equity Study. Lottery, where all applications scoring above a minimum baseline are entered into a drawing from which applicants will be selected at random, consistent with the number of permits available. Those applications selected will be allowed to move forward to the permitting process. And then first come, first serve, where applications are reviewed and scored in the order they are received. All applications scoring above a minimum baseline will be allowed to move forward to the permitting process until the maximum number of permits available has been reached. Determining the most appropriate process depends upon the number of permits available and the anticipated demand for those permits. Development of the application process is commonly done administratively and is subsequent to the development of a regulatory ordinance. At the 2 recent City Council study sessions, Council provided direction that the number of permits should be regulated by the zoning standards rather than a permit cap, and that the selection process should be lottery-based with equity applicants meeting qualifying criteria and done at the administrative level. So this is a hybrid model of both the equity and lottery-based selection processes. And then for implementation, administering and regulating cannabis businesses involves a variety of common local government functions. The decision of how to administer the cannabis program could depend on the number of cannabis businesses and the desired level of regulatory oversight. Cities and counties have a wide variety of options for how they administer cannabis regulatory programs, either placing primary oversight with a single department, assigning each aspect of oversight to their respective departments, or creating a dedicated cannabis department or division that has responsibility for all aspects of oversight. The creation of a cannabis division would require council budget actions and would depend on the number of businesses and whether it would justify the number of staff positions and resources required. Additionally, all cannabis businesses are required to obtain a permit from the Los Angeles County Department of Public Health. And in developing a cannabis regulatory program, the city should anticipate the impacts to staff time and other departmental costs associated with the permitting, regulation, and enforcement of those businesses. Cities commonly adopt fees for cost recovery adequate to cover all direct costs, which may include costs associated with the development of a commercial cannabis regulatory program, review and permitting of individual cannabis businesses, inspections, audits, monitoring permit renewals, mitigating external impacts in the community or the environment, and the enforcement and appeals. At Council's direction at the April 23rd, 2024 study session, City Planning staff is investigating contracting opportunities with the County of Los Angeles, as the city does not currently have a division dedicated to cannabis oversight to manage this program. Following the award of a $40,000 grant from the State of California Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, City Planning staff kicked off the Cannabis Social Equity Assessment with SCI Consulting Group, who we have contracted with to conduct the assessment. The equity assessment is anticipated to take approximately 3 to 4 months to complete, consisting of community outreach, demographic and criminal data analysis, review of California's best practices for cannabis equity, and recommendations for Santa Monica's equity program. Simultaneously, staff is drafting the adult use cannabis ordinance. It is anticipated that the draft ordinance and cannabis equity assessment will be brought forward to the commission for the commission's consideration before the end of 2024 and to City Council in early 2025. Once the ordinance is adopted and the equity assessment completed, staff will develop the administrative guidelines to establish the cannabis program. A future phase of this program is to apply for additional funding from the state for the cannabis equity program and implementation of it. So with that, our presentation is concluded, and we will now take questions.
Anybody have any questions?
I have questions in a few different directions. The first one is, to hear basically what I want to know is, are the impacts of having a cannabis outlet anywhere any different than having an alcohol outlet anywhere?
I think it depends on the conditions of approval or conditions of operation that are set, but I think the intention, from some cities we've spoken to, they say no, and they've taken the approach that's consistent with just an alcohol outlet, while others have gone through a much more extensive review process, such as like a CUP that has a lot of set conditions of approval to mitigate potential impacts.
So the reason they have the cities that don't follow the alcohol regulation model are anticipating some kind of further impact and want to have further review, or is it that there's actual evidence that there is additional impact or different impact?
In our research, we've not found anything that is definitive one way or the other. I think it's just at the comfort of the community and probably through their community outreach process where they heard from their community on what their comfort was. But, I think Tony was talking about the state buffers. So the state only has a 600-foot buffer from those couple sensitive uses. And council at their first study session said that they were comfortable with just those. Whereas, compared to our medicinal process, there were many more buffers and I think a lot more
I remember.
concern for impacts. So I think that's potentially, as the cannabis industry has developed, a change in what we've seen.
Okay.
I would augment that also, is that as part of council's direction, I think they were really clear, they did not want there to be a discretionary process for any cannabis business in the city. So council's given us that direction. They're
So
not.
that is more like the way the alcohol process is.
Yeah, very much so. It's sort of like standardized conditions, if you will, yeah.
So my other question about the equity side, that sounds massively complex. And the idea of a cannabis division in the city is something I have a hard time grasping. So what I wanted to know, what I'm thinking just in terms of what I envision would be a cool social equity program. So the money to support any kind of program, which would basically cost something, would have to come from only state grants, or could we use, since we have the ability to tax these cannabis stores, could we just make it a self-supporting program that the outlets support a social equity program? Is that like a reasonable, feasible thing?
Yeah, the state grants aren't to support the city's operation of the cannabis program. It's more so, the ongoing funding is direct funding to equity applicants that would be operating these businesses and to conduct the initial equity study and develop the equity program. So I don't think it's anticipated that there's funding from outside that could support this potential
So an
future
ongoing
division.
program would be funded by the taxes that the city
Yeah, if
collects?
council chose to allocate the taxes to that, that's a possibility.
And so then my other question is, if we're going to do an equity program to help, people who've experienced discrimination to, overcome obstacles, why would we only help them start cannabis businesses? Wouldn't we want to kind of come up with a small business support program that's more broad? And could we do that with cannabis money?
Again, that would be at council's
Right,
discretion of what they would do.
But is
with
it
the
possible, is
revenue.
that like a thing that could be considered? I'm thinking, about that Black apology we adopted, and we have our whole DEI department, and everybody's kind of waiting for something to roll out, and this sounds like a huge opportunity.
Yeah, the intent of this program, that's funded from the state to do this analysis is just the scope to understand the disproportionate impacts of communities through the criminalization of cannabis. And so looking at that specific scope, how we could help them as we've developed this new opportunity to engage with the city, how we can help them reduce barriers to re-enter that industry that's had an impact on their
So the
lives.
state money is about letting them make money from cannabis instead of go to jail from it? Or it's not that specific? That's what I'm
It
trying to
is
understand.
very specific to just cannabis.
I
Yeah.
see, okay. All right, so, but that's just for the study, but the city can decide its own program after it finishes the study? Unless they use state grants to give people?
Yeah, the state funding is very specific
Okay.
to how we can allocate it and what percentages, who it can go to. But I think there's examples of this type of work already happening in the city through the city's equity plan. So this is just like our specific scope that
Yeah,
we're
like we see,
investigating.
there's definitely a lot of crossover here, and the team has done a tremendous amount of research around best practices around equity programs in other cities. I mean, in many ways, because we are so late to the game, like, it's kind of a good thing. Like, we're learning from pretty much every other city in California and what they've done. And, I think what is coming to light here is the kind of technical assistance and direct assistance, that equity applicants have needed in cannabis programs is not super different than, I think, the calls we see for support for small business support and entrepreneurship generally in the city to support our local residents and the like. And so the conversation at council was kind of, as we were talking about an equity framework, was, really, about this notion of like, could this be a self-sustaining program? But I think beyond that, there's a desire to kind of stand up a cannabis program, and that, if it does become successful, it generates enough tax dollars that could be, then money that goes into the fund, and it could be reinvested in the community in a broader way, potentially, than only in cannabis. It could be used for other business support programs or business development programs and the like. It's sort of another revenue stream, if you will. So, but those ultimately become like council
Of course. I'm
budgeting
just trying to
decisions.
understand
Yeah, but
the-
I think just to share with you that context, like when we returned to council with a second study session on social equity, it was really for direction on like the approach, like how in-depth of an approach do you want to get? Because all of it costs, it's a lot of money and resources, like not just in staff time, but in money. And the state program, there's a second pot of funding for direct assistance. And as we're talking to other cities and industry leaders and people who have been working in this industry, like that truly is the only source of funding, it appears, that's out there, unless, cities set aside like monies from their own general fund, which most cities don't have, like millions and millions of dollars just sort of sitting around, for that purpose. So, I think we're definitely seeing a lot of crossover in that regard as we're kind of digging into the framework and sort of the bones of this program. But as Shira is saying, sort of step one is this equity assessment
Right.
to even understand, the situation here in Santa Monica and, how we might, what does our equity program look like?
Can I just repeat back one thing you said to make sure I understood it? Did you suggest that one idea is to invest the cannabis tax revenue back into the cannabis businesses at first to build it up so that there's enough revenue to broaden
I
it? Did you
think-
say that?
No, it was, I think
Okay.
council had asked, because there is like simultaneously interest in the revenue potential from cannabis, but also the desire to address the social equity component. There's like interest in both, and sort of, if we don't have all of the tools to provide direct technical assistance, is there another way that you could use, revenue generated from sort of, all of the cannabis businesses, if you will, right? And reinvest it in other parts of the community. Like it wouldn't just be for cannabis equity applicants, potentially it could be for, small business development, like generally.
Okay.
That's just an idea, that was discussed.
Okay, thank you so much.
I have a question for staff. I know the horse is out of the barn, so to speak. The council has approved this already, and you're just
Given direction to, proceed with it.
But what does the police department say? We have a big homeless population. Aren't we giving them opportunities to, if they drink or they take other drugs, that we're adding a drug to their menu, so to speak? And we've got issues with them in terms of crime and stuff like this. Are we not aggravating the situation? Has the council thought about this?
I think there's, from the map that Tony showed, I can go back. There's already a lot of cannabis businesses completely surrounding Santa Monica, and delivery is
Yeah, in
already
Venice,
coming in.
I know.
The police department would be heavily involved in the review of these permits, and the county has very strict guidelines and does enforcement to follow up with them. So I don't think that we've heard from other cities either that it's exacerbating that problem.
Do you want to go?
I just have one question. So I know there's an equity assessment being done. Is there any other lens besides race that is going to go into the equity assessment? Are you going to look at background or financial strength or anything of that nature?
Yeah, it will be evaluated against income, demographics, how long they've lived in the city. So it's looking at it in different lenses, as well as the greater effect that the criminalization of cannabis has had on Santa Monica.
Okay, so this is an equity assessment directed, I guess, sounds like towards current Santa Monica residents.
It would be, the assessment is pulling data all the way back from the 80s. So like when we say war on drugs, we mean that like time period as well.
Right, but are you just looking within the city of Santa Monica
Yeah.
or broadly?
Just
Okay.
the city of Santa Monica and what our criminal records show in conjunction with the demographic data.
Okay. So this would be equity applicants who are current residents of Santa Monica would apply through this portal.
Part of the assessment is establishing what the criteria are for equity applicants, so we don't know fully what that is yet. But examples could be their income, how long they've lived in the city. It could be if they currently live in the city or lived in the city during a certain period of time. That's yet to be established, but those are just examples of what we could make the criteria. And like, for example, another one is percentage of ownership of their business. So yeah, our consultants, based on best practices that they found from other California cities and what the data is showing here, will help us establish criteria that makes sense to allow enough people to qualify as equity applicants.
Okay. How would you manage that? You think you said there was like $1 million of startup costs to start some of these businesses. How do you juxtapose the goals of the equity program, which is to bring in people who would not otherwise have an opportunity, with $1 million startup cost? Who's going to bear that?
Yeah,
cost?
that's honestly one of the biggest barriers that we've heard. And one of the opportunities is the second, like the type 2 funding from the state, where it's direct assistance to equity applicants. So that's money that goes directly to them. And then, a lot of them unfortunately have to partner with investors because it is just a really big startup cost. But one of the options that could potentially have as a recommendation for the program is waiver or reduced fees of our permitting process. So there's small ways that we can help reduce that cost and assist with that.
Yeah.
And Shira, do you want to speak to like just examples? I think, was it San Francisco or like some cities had kind of ways to pair up equity applicants with sort of like investor groups. I think we saw some interesting partnerships, I guess, out there, but it's sort of fraught with like challenges because I
Yeah.
think what we have heard is there's a lot of like fraud and corruption actually
Yeah.
around it, and you know, people who are like truly not equity applicants, and so we
Yeah, and
kind
we
of found a lot of information that way.
Yeah,
right?
we spoke with a consultant who's helping the county with their program, and they're very involved in cannabis equity advocacy. They themselves have experienced going through this process as an operator. And one of their biggest recommendations to kind of combat predatory investments when equity applicants feel forced to partner with investors is having business development and assistance from the city or other sources to really educate them in like contract reading, what they're actually agreeing to, profit sharing, all of that type of thing that's may not be in their wheelhouse. And so offering support in those ways. Another, you know, it also, equity doesn't only have to mean you can be an operator. It means perhaps that some retailers are carrying equity products or products that come from equity
Okay.
types of businesses.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the other question I had to do with percentage of ownership for that very reason. And so, you know, oftentimes in the industry that I work in, there is also a desire to broaden the base of those who participate in these various programs. And what we often see is it's not a negative situation. It's not like an equity applicant is being forced into a partnership. They're actually soliciting partners, and it's actually a proactive relationship. But the ownership percentage is important because you want it to be a true equity ownership and not just a 1% ownership type of situation where certain applicants are getting a leg up or special treatment because of the partnership they've structured.
Right.
And the real decisions are being made elsewhere. Have you looked into, it sounds like you've thought through that, but how would you, it's a complicated issue, but how would the city staff govern that type of thing in terms of the partnership agreements that would be coming before you?
It's up to us when we establish what the criteria is for an equity applicant, what percentage of ownership we would require. But ultimately, every city that we've talked to has been very transparent that it's something that's just really hard to regulate and oversee, given that there's, sales can happen after they get the license. Like, it's something that we just know is going to be difficult, that we might have to revisit.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's helpful.
Pierre?
Yeah, had a couple of questions. You touched on the council's direction regarding the selection process, and I think you characterized it as a hybrid between lottery and equity.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, so the direction that we received at the last council study session was that they wanted to be an administrative process, which aligns most with a lottery-based process, where if you pass certain qualifications, you get put in the lottery. But equity is obviously important and at the forefront to the program that we're developing. So we want to incorporate that, where if you're an equity applicant, you meet these qualifying criteria that we'll establish. And it hasn't quite been addressed yet, but it's a possibility. Some cities have done it where they set a percentage of, if they're doing a number of permits, percentage of permits aside for equity applicants before they will pull a lottery for general applicants. Or there's opportunities. Council also gave the direction that they want that 300-foot buffer between cannabis businesses. So a potential recommendation for the program is that equity applicants could have a reduced buffer. That's an example that we've seen from other cities. So that would allow more equity applicants as well.
Was there any discussion about the merit-based process? I'm curious to know what caused that to be taken off the table.
Yeah, it
in, say, in
was-
conjunction with equity.
It was presented to council as an option, and certainly other cities have done it. It is really only possible with a discretionary process. So was the big impetus for removing it as something that council was considering, because they wanted it to be an administrative.
So, just to make sure I understand, so if you had a scoring system that was totally transparent, that wouldn't be
That-
compatible with a non-discretionary process?
Yeah, the merit-based process is fraught with challenges. When the city of Santa Monica first allowed medicinal retailers, it was through a merit-based process. The zoning ordinance was approved in 2015 to allow the medicinal retailers. By the time we got through the process, scoring the applicants, going through that process, having a number of non-qualifying applicants appeal the decisions and all the legal challenges, the two retailers that we have only just opened in the last year or so. So it does present a lot of challenges, which makes it not the most ideal process to go through.
My next question you may have answered. I was just going to ask. We have two existing businesses, but they haven't been there long enough to, and they're a small sample, but is there anything we've learned from their operation?
Not quite. We have received some complaints already about their limited hours of operation. Their current CUPs allow them to remain open till, I believe, 8 or 9 p.m. State law allows retailers to be open till 10 p.m. And so I know we've heard from them that they would like to have extended hours of operation to help their business out. So that's something we'll deal with. But besides that,
I think we've heard, probably this is not so much about operations, but just like the general state of the industry from operators. And I know the team's visited with operators that have kind of invited our staff to come and visit, their operations as we're kind of learning, about the current state. Because the last time we did sort of a comprehensive review like this was before 2015. It was like 2013, I think. So it's really been quite some time before we've delved into this. And the landscape of cannabis has changed a lot. The sort of, I think, hopefulness around it, from 10 years ago, and the kind of revenue potential maybe has dissipated. You've probably seen a lot of news articles, right, about, bankruptcies and kind of like a lot of challenges that the industry is facing around it. And it is a highly, highly regulated industry that in and of itself, I think in the attempt to make it safe, it appears it's also kind of added cost to it. And it's still very much competing with like unregulated cannabis. We have another consultant that's been advising us, HDL, that's sort of a leader in this field. And, they conducted kind of a very preliminary retail tax analysis. They're going to do a more comprehensive one just to understand kind of the revenue part of this, which is, obviously a lot of the council's interest in it. And, with Santa Monica being very late to the game. And as you saw on that map, there are a lot of operators already operating around Santa Monica. We don't quite understand the impact of delivery as well. Again, last time we talked about this, it was still new, brick and mortar and the like. And I think we're really trying to think through, kind of balancing a program that addresses the social equity component, but also wanting it to be successful. And so these two operators that just got started, I think they're not even been operation even 6 months yet, I think, as adult use. I think we'll understand once we get a year's worth of tax receipts, sort of like, how is it to do business here? Like, what is the market? Because like there's so much around in LA and delivery, like, we just don't know how much that is cutting into, the Santa Monica market. So, lots to be, it's very much early days, on this. But yeah, that's, I think, what we've generally heard from the operators that are here now.
I have one other question. I know that there are distance restrictions, like for schools and stuff like that. Are we going to prevent people from smoking or using cannabis in the parks and stuff like that, as we do with alcohol?
Well, you cannot smoke doesn't matter what you're smoking, you cannot smoke in a public park or in public places.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, it does, yeah, right. We have a municipal code
Yeah, but
that
people can
exists
eat.
already.
People can eat, brownies and stuff like that and ingest it in other ways,
I mean, consumption of, controlled substances, that becomes an enforcement matter. But I understand, it would be hard to distinguish, yeah.
Yeah, that's all I'm saying. It's just.
Pierre has one more question.
Pierre, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. Actually, you have it up on the map. I was just curious how micro businesses are defined.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a variety of ways that micro businesses can be defined, and they kind of vary by jurisdiction. In general, at least in kind of this region, a micro business is defined as a business that has multiple types of cannabis licenses all in one business. So there's usually smaller scale businesses, but they are allowed to do multiple things, such as cultivate, as well as sell and test all like together in one site.
But they do or they do not necessarily mean they're small. Are they necessarily small operators?
It's, this is something that council brought up in the first study session that they were interested in us exploring. But it allows for the co-location of multiple businesses within one building to reduce the costs, capital costs.
Understood. Thank you.
Is there anybody else on the count? We have one shit from Jerry Rubin.
Oh, thanks a lot. Commissioners, oh gosh, I can imagine 20, 30 years from now, you're going to see it sold everywhere, just like cigarettes or anything else, even in 7-Eleven stores and Ralph's Market. That's what I'm thinking will probably be happening. I don't drink or smoke anything myself, but I see the direction here. I'm sure there's a big difference between medical marijuana and there's people thinking about it. I guess thing is, I don't think I would get high on anything stronger than a soy latte these days. But I had my share over the years. It's kind of funny in a way that there's a dispensary on the 1400 block of Wilshire Boulevard, and I'm thinking that's great because it's right near C's Candy. So, come on, drum roll. I'm supposed to laugh at that. I remember, so I think it's a pretty comprehensive report. I think it's just starting out, and you just want to be careful about it with restrictions. And as far as people aren't going to be able to smoke like they drink in clubs or places, because of the rules we have for outdoor patios and any places. So that's out of the question, but I don't know if anything will happen with things you ingest, which might be better than smoking it, actually. But if you were going to sell like a marijuana brownie in a restaurant, Is that allowed now or not? And is there going to be any discussion of hemp things along with this stuff, clothing, soap, or, I mean, that's, because I have a hemp T-shirt at home. So I just wanted to raise my concerns, but understanding, I don't want to sound like an old fuddy-duddy, but, you know, I'm not a big fan of just getting high. I've seen what drugs can do. Lives can be lost. Someone once said the best way to get kids off of drugs is to create a world to escape from. So it's something to think about.
Yes.
I was so caught up in the content of the report that I forgot to say how great that report was. It was really comprehensive, and I learned all kinds of things I didn't know before, so thank you.
Is there any other commission discussion that we should start the discussion?
Yeah, I just have comments. If you want to start with comments, I'll just start with,
Yeah.
you know, I agree, comprehensive report. I learned things about marijuana industry I was not aware of. I guess there's an opportunity for a, you know, tax stream here that's important, and I see the value of the social equity component. So I think that's really important. I think you've hit on a lot of the key things that I have very little understanding of the social equity portion of it. I've seen the city of LA they took a swing at this, and I think they failed pretty badly at it. And I think, you know, you hit on a really important concept is how do you get the social, and Commissioner Hamilton talked about it too, is how do you give social equity to somebody who doesn't have that financial wherewithal but needs the $1 million? And then how do you make sure they're not just a front for, you know, a real, I don't want to say a real business, but a bigger money organization behind them? Which I think leads to the kind of the comment about merit-based is I think the ones who are merit-based are the ones who are going to bring all these resources and are going to put the best application. And that, once again, is going to lead to the side that has the more money. So you have a tough task ahead of you. I'm interested to see what comes back. I do say that I would say that the 600 feet seems appropriate to me, and I would caution us on the fees. I think the LA Business Journal ran an article yesterday, it was in local papers, that we're not doing so well on our business fees for businesses, depending on how you look at it. So we want to be careful, mindful of that as well. Those are my comments, and thank you, and I look forward to it coming back.
Any other commissioners have comments?
I have a question, just more about a point of order. So this being a study session, are we going to now have comment within or discussion within the planning commission, or are we going to field all of our questions and comments with staff here?
You can, this is a study session, so
Okay.
it's
So
totally
it's
the
not
opportunity to ask questions, have discussion. I think we agendize it as also possible direction, so you have a very broad
Okay.
purview.
All right.
Yeah.
So, okay, great. Thank you. So I have a couple other questions or comments, I guess, that I can just ask now. So again, thank you for the report. I thought it was really good. So it sounds like you guys have broken things down with a couple directions that you want us to talk about. There is the 600 feet from sensitive uses. This is all coming from council. There's a 300-foot buffer between individual stores. Council doesn't want no more than one per block. They don't want a cap on licenses, but they are open to a natural cap through limiting the location of these stores. They want there to be some kind of equity-based application process done through a lottery system. And they're open to all forms of cannabis businesses, from lounges, consumption lounges, cultivation, processing, distribution, retail, cannabis convention, and they don't want these in non-residential areas. I noticed that, just a general question, I would assume each of these licenses will be done through a CUP process, or no? Okay, they don't want to do, okay, so that's what that means. There's no discretion through a CUP.
Yeah, we were directed to not approach this with a discretionary application process at all, that it should be administrative.
Okay. The reason why the two current businesses did require a CUP is because we haven't yet drafted this ordinance, right?
Correct. This would specifically address just the adult use, or commonly known as recreational cannabis uses.
What was the reasoning for excluding cannabis consumption from alcohol consumption in the CUP process?
Well, actually, the state prohibits alcohol consumption in cannabis consumption.
No, I mean,
launches
just,
already.
there are in certain zones of the city, you need a CUP to operate, have a liquor license. You don't, nowhere?
I think it's, I
Have we
think
taken
it's
that
a
out?
standard set of conditions, and if you say I can meet these standard set of conditions, more administrative.
I thought it was within the downtown area in certain zones and that some of the
No,
parts.
we have, yeah, we have like an alcohol exemption, like citywide, but council's decision or direction to not have a discretionary process, I think was based on what they were seeing happening in other cities with respect to a discretionary process and how long that process took. And, I think going back, like there were literally, I think, instances of, because it was connected with a discretionary selection process, then that opened the gates, unfortunately, to some instances of corruption, actually, because, elected officials were involved and the like. There were cities that have experienced that. And so I think kind of learning from what we've seen in other cities and sort of best practices, moving forward, the evolution of it is really suggesting sort of a administrative process. The rules are clear. It's like you either meet it or you don't.
Okay.
You can
As
provide
long
more
as you're
background.
within the proper zoning areas, yeah,
Right.
okay,
Exactly.
okay.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, with alcohol, we have our alcohol exemption and our CUP, and the alcohol exemption is a streamlined process with a set standard of conditions of approval that the applicant is agreeing to.
Okay.
And the CUP is a deviation from those. They're saying we don't want to comply with them. But in the situation of cannabis, the state heavily regulates it. So for example, an alcohol exemption has set hours, and it's up to the planning commission's discretion if a CUP comes before them to extend those hours to what the applicant requests. But in the situation with cannabis, it's limited to 10 p.m., so we didn't see a benefit from a regulatory perspective in offering an additional pathway around a streamlined administrative process
Okay.
because of the state standards.
Okay, so we'll just fall under the state standards in that respect. Okay,
Well, and also, if I may too, there are also separate business regulatory rules that cannabis businesses will have to follow as well. So they have to get a separate, not only a business license, but a separate cannabis permit. And there are a set of regulatory requirements that accompany that. Those regulations are not necessarily embedded in the zoning ordinance. They're actually going to be found in Article 6 and in some administrative regulations. We actually have that in place already. So there is a separate regulatory system that they have to follow as well, in addition to all of the zoning requirements.
okay, thanks. I noticed it's in the staff report that when Santa Monica first opened the door to medical marijuana dispensaries, you limited the locations for those along specific stretches within the general commercial and mixed-use zones within the city. And so that was, it sounds like you want to, or we're considering this idea of broadening that significantly, whereas 10 years ago, it was a very specific zone along three different streets. And now the city's open to having this kind of throughout the city insofar as you're not in a residential area or within, according to these buffer zones. I think that's something we should, I feel like that's something we should talk about more. I mean, I think that is Mr. Rubin suggested, I don't think we're all 100% sold on whether more people should be consuming cannabis. And I think there are going to be some, community concerns. And I do think it behooves the Planning Commission to offer some kind of guidance to where these businesses would be located. I mean, already the city is, put in some, some guidelines. But I think that I think we should have more discussion about whether we want this to be diffuse throughout the city or have it along certain, zoned, specifically areas zoned for commercial use or higher intensity commercial use.
Yeah, I think one of the, if I can just kind of give some context to that, is what we did find is by limiting it that much, when it was first opened to medicinal cannabis, it had the effect actually of actually affecting the rents that, it essentially gave a windfall to properties that fell within these very, very limited zones. Yeah, I think, Tony, you putting it up there? No, that's not. No, there was, I think there's a map we don't have here that showed the medicinal cannabis buffers. It was, as you're saying, like 3 locations in the city, extremely limited. And we actually heard from operators, they were having a really hard time finding or negotiating leases with landlords because landlords knew they couldn't go anywhere else. And so it artificially inflated the price of those rents, which created yet another barrier. And that was, kind of one of those unintended consequences, if you will. And I think, lessons learned from that. Yeah.
And if you look at this map, it shows by taking into account the state buffer, citywide in all of the commercial or non-residential districts, you're really still only left with 426 parcels where somebody would be eligible to have a cannabis business.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do. The thing I remember about the second cannabis permit that we reviewed was that it was very near the first one, and there was a lot of discussion on the Planning Commission about that. And the problem was, I mean, where else would they go? They took them long enough to find that. And also that we talked a lot about the idea of having cannabis businesses near each other gives the consumer more of an opportunity to shop, puts a little pressure on them to compete with each other, and is not necessarily a bad thing. So I'm concerned about the 300 feet between each one idea when we already have such limited sites for these businesses in just with the 600-foot sensitive use thing. And then add to that a cannabis business, especially if we're going the social equity route that is not secretly funded by deep pockets in the background and is on the level, is going to be a small business, and finding small retail spaces that are affordable for small businesses is another big problem we have in our city. So I think it's very self-regulating is basically what I'm saying. And we don't need to add extra layers. The 600 feet, which the state gave us, is plenty. That's my feeling on that. I guess in general, I don't see cannabis as any different from alcohol, so I don't see it as more of a threat to the community or to our safety or anything like that. And, a lot of the rhetoric that led to it becoming legal in the first place was that having it regulated actually makes it safer. So, I don't think we should push too hard against it, and there's plenty of rules. That's what I think.
Josh, do you have something else?
Well, I mean, I guess I would be interested in, you continuing to use the same overlay that we had when we were looking at medicinal marijuana use, but extending that, in extending that through the entire boulevard, as opposed to just certain segments, and extending it into the the general commercial zoning, as opposed to trying to create some kind of natural buffer along, keeping this along the boulevards as we originally did, as opposed to what the map is that we saw, which is a more diffuse use.
Josh, aren't those really long commercial boulevards? I mean, I see some outliers maybe at 26 where there's the 26th and San Vicente commercial area.
Well,
And I thought that was kind of the focus of the city, was to keep it in these commercial districts, and then you overlay that 600 feet to sensitive uses, and that's what really carves up the land limits the land.
Yeah, I don't think we limit which
But I think-
commercial districts.
And I think maybe for your point, maybe we need to limit maybe we need to look at the 300 feet, because then it opens up more areas.
Yeah, I'd be opening to Nina's suggestion of reducing the 300-foot barrier, but then having it allowable in the, sorry, give me a second here. Taking it out of neighborhood commercial, basically.
When you say the 300 foot, that's the location between, the proximity between them, not from a sensitive use.
Yeah.
Okay.
300, limiting, looking at more of a geographic restriction, but then within the allowable area, the allowable zones, allowing for less than a 300-foot buffer to address some of the issues that you brought up. So hopefully the same amount of sites are going to become available. We're not restricting the number of parcels, but we are restricting the distribution.
If you take out neighborhood commercial, do you see how few parcels are left? There's like 10 parcels. Well, maybe 30, but
I don't think so.
it's like more than half. Main Street,
No,
Ocean Park
that's the
Boulevard.
600-foot buffer. That's looking at it through a 600-foot buffer as opposed to
600-foot
300.
buffer is the state law. It's the 300 feet between each business that is not even reflected in that. The one where they show the 300 feet, there's like 92 parcels allowed,
Can't go less.
62. I knew it was a small number. I mean, that's just not,
That's just,
I mean, then see, those 62 parcels then have to be available for rent on top of everything else. That's just not enough opportunity to get anything off the ground. That's where we are now with our two.
Isn't the one business per block an even more restrictive provision than the 300-foot? And I'm not sure how that got factored in, but.
Yeah, the 300-foot buffer would in most cases essentially result in no more than one per block.
I have.
I think another, like, just to maybe help the conversation a bit, is I think what we have seen in some equity programs is they have actually eliminated the buffer for equity applicants, as a way. So I think obviously none of this has been created yet, but we have seen kind of like more flexibility in zoning rules and things like that, when it comes to providing, advantages for equity applicants, right?
Yeah, and I also want to point out that this 600-foot state buffer is the default, but that we have to have those buffers, the distance, it can be adjusted by the city. So we can't eliminate a buffer, but we can change the distance.
Okay.
I have another concern, but it's nothing that we can deal with in this commission. That is cannabis, like other products, is being developed. They're developing stronger products. And it's out of our control. I know if it's just a Pandora's box in the sense that we may be getting stuff that that affects people differently.
It's interesting. I think the last time we talked about this, there was a discussion too about in the testing process that they could test the intensity of the strain, something to that effect, which I think addresses that kind of concern about, so people would understand this is a significantly intense strain or something to that effect. So I think that could be part of the testing, frankly. So I think this is interesting. I thought I had read that the 600-foot was what the state had suggested, but we had the opportunity to move that. But what you're saying, we can move it, we just can't eliminate it. So I think if we move that number down to 300 feet, you would provide more areas within the city, because that's from sensitive uses I'm talking about. I'm not talking about from each other.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking it more of keeping the 600 feet from sensitive uses, but reducing the 300 foot between, so you could basically, the default would be one per block.
It's the same
potentially.
thing, is what staff was
Yeah,
saying.
no, I understand.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's either going to be less than 300 feet between each dispensary or one per block, whatever is less or greater.
Right, correct.
Yeah, okay.
Or just rely on the 600-foot buffer and not require that 300-foot between.
Yeah, but then you would also have to eliminate the one per block.
Yeah, we should eliminate that too, yes.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Just to reiterate that, Nina, you're saying just do the 600-foot from sensitive uses and eliminate the one per block or the proximity to two stores.
Yes.
Okay.
But I think the balance to that is to only allow that in general commercial, mixed-use boulevard, and potentially our industrial areas as well. That way we are not reducing the number of parcels, hopefully available for this type of use, to address what we heard about the gouging that some landlords can do. But we're containing that land use within those zoning districts.
I mean, we have such a small city, it's not really putting a big burden on somebody to drive there. But again, 10 years ago on this commission, we would have been harping on VMTs and that we need to reduce VMTs, and having activity nodes are important. And so to carve those out of neighborhood commercial areas would go against that. But again, we have a very small city, so it's very easy to get around.
Well, right now, according to the map they get, everyone in Santa Monica's not having a problem at all, just zipping over to Venice to get what they need. All those pot stores right on the border, did you see that?
Those are just like big box stores. There's all kinds of businesses that want to come in and they're not.
Can we also understand some of the, what is special about the NC relative to other commercial districts?
Yeah.
Like, I think we just want to understand the rational basis for, why the NC would be excluded.
I'm just following the precedent that was set for the medical dispensary zones. So I think there was more of an incrementalist, I guess. And so I'm seeing this as we have had, these certain areas designated, and rather than going from that to, which I think was probably too limited, but going from that to something that's much more diffuse throughout the city, I think is a big step. I would rather incrementally just continue to allow, rather than just limiting it to those specific street blocks within that zoning overlay, allowing those in all of all of the parcels within that zoning overlay to qualify, just as an incremental approach.
Okay.
Another quick question. How do you get from the 437 eligible parcels to the 62 possible businesses?
Yeah, the 432 doesn't account for the buffer between businesses.
Oh, okay.
So once you add that layer,
It's not necessarily eligible once you factor that in.
yes.
And the 432 includes neighborhood commercial also. Just in terms of the social equity piece, I mean, I still don't really quite understand all the financing 100%, but just as a general recommendation, I think that communities of people that have experienced discrimination and have not been able to get their foot in the door to starting small businesses and moving up in economically the way their peers who haven't experienced discriminated have been able to do. I feel like a broader, I would just like to write down somewhere for council to see that the idea of a broader program that really affects the broader community of people who've experienced discrimination, but who might not want to start a pot store. I just think that broader approach is much more valuable. Even if we can only do a little bit, we got to do something. We haven't started any of it. We're late to the game in pot stores and in our social equity issues.
I wonder how much of the equity issue is really an issue of this commission, anyway.
It's everyone's issue.
Well, we're talking about ownership equity.
On the equity point too, when you guys are talking about having folks from the community, there was a discussion that you'd look back over the years. Would that include somebody, let's say in the 1980s, I was selling pot and I got thrown in jail for it. And when I got out of jail, I couldn't afford to live in Santa Monica. And now I'm living somewhere far away. That person's going to get captured into this review.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the purposes of the equity assessment is to take some of that quantitative data in terms of like incarcerations or infractions that are specifically related to cannabis. And then also the quantitative or qualitative data is distributing a survey for those that are willing to offer their insights on how that has specifically impacted them so that we can develop a program that caters those populations specifically within our community. So yeah, we are looking to see what those individual impacts have been for a variety of different people and in a variety of different ways. So we only know of what other equity assessments that we've studied and read through have revealed about those communities, but it's so important for us to be able to understand how it's impacted our community members, even folks that, are simply just renting or just employed here, or, folks that are just interested in how this develops and can they possibly have a stake in this industry.
Great, thank you.
Any other comments?
Just the last comment I'd say is it's the diversity, equity, inclusion issue is really important, and it does touch on a lot of businesses around. And I know that my office just went through this where we were trying to get to work with LAX, and we had to come up with a program, and we spent hours. It was a small business trying to put this together, and it was hours that was sunk costs, and on the promise that we might get a project down the road. And so it's really hard. And so it's nice that the state has stepped up and attached some funding to that because, that wasn't available to my business. And again, that was a lost sunk costs on the hope of something good happening. So kudos to the state for thinking about that.
I'm not too old to learn.
None of us are. Okay.
If that's all the comments, I guess there's nothing else on the agenda, so we can adjourn the meeting.
Well, don't we have to kind of take our formal steps through the rest of the items and acknowledge them?
I can't hear you.
She wants you.
Mike, I said, I think, don't we have to acknowledge the rest of the items, or can we just ignore them?
Can
No,
we?
it's okay.
can
Yeah,
we
I mean,
wait?
you can, like you were saying, there's no further
Yeah,
other business on the agenda. That's fine.
I'm not ignoring them.
Just not wasting time.
I don't want to hurt their feelings.
They're not hurting my feelings.
No, I meant the agenda items' feelings.
They're inanimate. Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.